We live in the world of big data. Big data drives everything around us. It drives AI. It drives our choices. It drives what ads we see, and it's probably driving a lot of what we're doing in business. So today we're going to discover how big data is flawed by design, and how the gap between reality and what's easily measurable will have profound impacts on both your business and your happiness. And I am so excited to have an expert in this area. He wrote the book called The Score: How to Stop Playing Somebody Else's Game. I'm with Dr. Thi Nguyen, who is a professor at my alma mater, University of Utah. T, it's great to have you on the Qualitative Show.
It's great to be here.
And if you would, give us a little of your background. I mean, it's interesting. It's philosophy, but I understand philosophy and game theory go
Right.
together. That's actually the class I took in the philosophy department at the University of Utah was game theory. And
Ah,
I was fascinated by it when I took the class, and I'm still fascinated by it 45 years later. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you
right.
started looking at big data.
Okay. There are I have two specialties in philosophy. One is slightly weird and one is unbelievably weird. The slightly weird specialty is I think about how knowledge gets made together socially, how scientists work together, how people work together. And the more you look at that right now, the more you start to understand the core linchpin of how knowledge moves and gets made is data, and especially data in bureaucratic settings. So that's half of what I study. The other half of what I study, I have this odd specialty in the philosophy of games. And I don't mean game theory,
Okay.
not like economic game theory, but understanding why we play board games, why we engage in hobbies.
Interesting.
I'm a rock climber, why we do that. And at some point in my life, I had written two papers, one of which had said that games are beautiful art forms where the scoring system lets us be free and flexible and explore new kinds of life. And I'd written another paper about how metrics are a kind of scoring system in bureaucracies and institutions that
Mhm.
suck the life out of everything
Yep.
and miss everything that's important. And then I realized these two things uh, were completely incompatible. And so I wrote a book trying to explain to myself why, in some contexts, scoring systems were so playful and fun, and why, in other cases, scoring systems seemed to like make us miss everything that's important. And I
Literally
was
suck the
involved.
life out of you.
Yeah, yeah. And I was involved in since a lot of this comes from I'm a philosopher, I'm a professor, but I also, do a lot of administrative roles. And for a long time, my job was the liaison officer for my department in charge of learning outcomes, which meant I
Okay.
had to quantify for external gaze uh, our success in teaching our students philosophy. And I started seeing that that was not the kind of thing that I could quantify in the terms that bureaucracy would find acceptable.
So let's just start with big data generally,
Okay.
because I mean, the biggest companies in the world are data companies, right?
Right.
They're Google, they're Meta, they're Amazon. These are data companies, and they have kind of taught us over the years that big data, is the answer
Right.
to really connecting with our customers, getting
Right.
information out there, targeting them, et cetera. Um, but you think that there's severe limitations
Yeah.
on big
Yeah.
data. Can you explain that?
Right. So I'm not, there's another kind of person who's going to come here and tell you that big data can't do anything. I'm not that person. Big data is incredibly powerful and it can get you incredibly good information about what we have data about and about the kinds of things that we have measures about. What I'm really concerned with is that there's deep limitations in the kinds of things that we can gather big data about. And one of the crucial things to remember is that what we're not talking about like what can science do in the abstract in a perfect world. We're talking about data sets we can analyze under real world conditions under which the largest data sets are data that can be uh, collected cheaply and easily at scale. So one of my founding moments that led me to this whole project was I got sucked into this conference um, about 6 years ago in the early era of people moving towards art making AI and creative AI, before we have what we had right now. And I was in this room full of computer scientists and machine learning specialists. I was the one philosopher who specialized in art and the value of art. And they were all telling me they were making incredibly good AI to make highly valuable art, like really rich, deep art. And I was like, what's your target data? Like, how are you measuring artistic success? And they were like, well, we're just using Netflix's database for engagement hours. And I lost my mind. And I was like, look, engagement hours is not goodness in art. Art is good because it enriches you, it enlarges you, it gives you deep pleasure, it can change you. And engagement hours measures addiction, basically,
Right.
right? And what they said was, well, show us another huge data set that can measure what you care about. And I think sitting there in the back of this room, I thought, there's not going to be a big data set that captures richness or understanding or growth through art. There is going to be a massive data set for things like engagement hours. And I really wanted to understand why. And what I've done in the last 5 years is taken this long trawl through the history of data to understand why we don't have good data sets that measure things like growth or wisdom or reflection, and why we do have data sets that measure things like mortality rates, lifespan, speed of graduation, engagement hours.
So, so what do you see? So, what are some of these limitations? I mean, you talk
Right,
about really the data is limited. You're just saying the data is limited. There are certain things it cannot capture.
right,
Now, you also talk about big data being systematically flawed on design by
right,
design. Okay.
right.
I want to hear your thoughts on that because then I
Okay,
want to explore it in the context of AI because I
okay,
actually think that's where we see it the most right now.
awesome, great. Okay, so there are two kinds of um, two kinds of what you might think of flaws in data. One is, I think, a contingent one based on what a particular institution decided to record. So I work with my students a lot, and we talk about how um, the university records things like graduation rate and graduation speed, but they don't record things like students' sense of happiness or how many friends they make. But that's data they could record in some sense,
Mhm.
right? So the first level is that we tend to have data on what large-scale institutions decide to record in the first place, right?
Got it.
But I think that's only the tip of the iceberg. What's really important is I think there are certain things that by the design of what data is, we will never get deep data on, a lot of information about. There are certain kinds of things that are systematically non-capturable by institutional methods of data
Yeah.
gathering.
For example,
Okay, so um, the 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 place where I really started understanding this was a book from Theodore Porter called Trust in Numbers. So he's a historian that works on quantification culture. And he was really interested in why politicians and administrators often reached for quantitative justifications for metrics, even when everyone knew those metrics were bad. And
mm,
he gave an explanation that I think explained so much to me. What he said was that there are two ways of knowing: quantitative and qualitative. So qualitative knowing is like writing things down, describing them. Quantitative knowing is data. And what he said was each of them is good at different things. It's not that database knowing is bad. It's that it's good for certain kinds of tasks, but we tend to reach for it compulsively. So what he said, this is the nugget. I can see you're like on the edge of like you want the key. Here's the first key. He says that qualitative ways of knowing are rich and context sensitive and open-ended. You can shift them around, you can
right.
change them to what really matters, but they travel badly between contexts because they require high shared background to understand. Quantitative ways of knowing in institutions, in bureaucracies and schools and corporations, are designed to collect a kernel that's been made to be context insensitive. It's a context invariant kernel. And so if everyone understands the same kernel and collects into it in the same way, then that information can travel between people in vastly different contexts and be aggregated easily. So one way to think about it, in my context as a university professor, qualitative ways of knowing are like what I write on my student essays. I can respond to the particular things they do. I know that some of my students want to be lawyers, I want to be nurses. I can change, I can respond on the fly. I can talk in multiple dimensions, right? I can talk about them being original versus them being thoughtful versus them being careful or clear in writing. But a lot of what I write there, A, won't be comprehensible to someone in the business school,
Right.
and B, will not aggregate easily. That's the essence, right? If different people are writing different qualitative assessments on different spectrums in their own terms, we can't get ready aggregation, instant aggregation. Think then about, on the other hand, about GPA, right? A GPA is a stable, right, set of meanings. We know what an A means approximately. We know what a B means. And everyone across the university, across multiple universities, across the hiring landscape knows the same meaning. So everyone can collect into it quickly, right? Those meanings transfer. Like, I don't know what a CS professor's assessment of their students in words means, but I know what a B means, right? And so what we get from data is engineered portability. This is the
Mhm.
term
Got it.
that Porter uses. He says that what data is a kind of understanding that's been prepared and cleansed to travel and be easily understood by distant strangers. Right. And so if you want to understand I mean, here's the first weird thought. The trip from qualitative to quantitative data involves weeding out all kinds of high context, highly subtle kinds of understanding that need lots of sensitivity and lots of training. And what you get is ready aggregability at scale. That's the trade-off, right? And does that make sense so far?
It makes sense. Let me put it in my terms. I'm an accountant. So in my
Right,
terms, the readily transferable data is 2 + 2 = 4,
right,
right? Anybody can understand that. But in an accounting context, if you ask a good accountant what's 2 + 2, their response should be, what do you want it to be?
right,
Because we've got a different context for what 2 + 2 could be, right? 2
right,
+ 2 could be 8, could be 16, right? Based on the context of what you're describing.
right. Um, can I try
Please.
this connects to a different part of my book. Let me try another angle on you. So what I said before was that data is portable, which means that exactly. So in each of these cases, you pay a price, and the price there is high context sensitivity,
Okay.
right? Which means, and you asked what we lost from data. What we lose from large scale data systems is any kind of information that requires a large amount of context to understand. Right.
I love that.
Um,
That
so,
actually explains to me a lot of the problems with asking a question of AI.
right, right. So that's the first thing. The first idea is portability. The second idea I think that's really important is that data is mechanically collected. And I think we have the sense that there's like step counts are mechanical, a feeling of well-being and health isn't
Yeah.
mechanical, right? And I was trying to understand this, and the key for me was this incredible book called Rules by Lorraine Daston, and she's an intellectual historian of science, and she's interested in different kinds of rules over the ages. And she says a lot in the olden days, a lot of the rules we had were what she calls principles. They were kind of general, abstract
Hmm.
statements, but they
Sure.
admitted of exceptions, and you had to apply them with discretion and care, knowing that there would be a lot of exceptions, right? So, in creative writing, for me, that was like show, don't tell, which is a useful rule for a beginner, but experts break it all the time if you actually understand what's going on. Um, that gets replaced, she says, in the last 200 years with 300 years with what she calls an algorithm. It's a mechanical
Right.
rule, and that's a rule that's designed to be applied without variation, absolutely as written, without any exceptions or judgment. And a lot of people, she says, think that algorithms arise with computing, but she says they arose about 100 years before computing machines. They arose in an attempt to cheapen labor by not having to hire highly complicated mathematical experts, and out of an interest in being able to replace them with basically high school graduates or a quick BA, right? Someone that has a standard education that
So,
can just apply the rule as written.
so what would be an example of an early algorithm?
Okay, so her early examples. So, okay, more accessible example, I think, is the difference between like how my mother cooks and what's written down in a recipe, right? How my mother cooks is this complex sense of adaptable variables.
Right.
When I look at a recipe, it says do this, do this, do this, add 2 cups, add 3 cups. It does not say to do what my mother did, which is to taste the tomatoes and adjust the recipe to how they're tasting, right? That's not something that can be followed mechanically. In the early days, what Daston says, the navigational charts, but most importantly, actuarial tables for insurance
Mhm.
adjusters were some of the earliest examples of
Got it.
mechanical procedures. And I wanted to say this because of what you said, like what 2 plus 2 means. One of the things that's really interesting is we've gotten to a point where people think that math has no judgment in it. It's just
Right.
mechanical. But here's my example that I
I
give my
think
students.
that's comical.
Yeah, right? Okay. So I'm going to give you an example, and I want your example from
Yeah.
accounting world. So my example is, so if you want to divide a slice of pie in half, here's some different methods. One, you could divide it by weight. Two, you could use a protractor and get an exact angle. Three, you could use the I cut you choose method, right? Each of these yields a different result, and it's good for a different purpose. So dividing it by weight is probably good if you're a nutritionist who's measuring like calories. Dividing it with a protractor is probably good if you're like trying to do a photo shoot. And if you're like me, like a parent with like 2 kids arguing, you want to use I cut you choose, right? There's not one, like there's not exactly one way to divide a pie in half. There's a lot of different methodologies, and an expert is someone that has a sensitive understanding of which methodology is the right methodology. But that's not mechanical. That won't scale up in the right way, right? So here's the second idea about how data works. Um, what data, for large scale data collection, what you need is a target that's mechanically collectible. It's a method for measurement that, okay, you're
Yeah.
giving me a,
Give me an
okay,
example. Tell me what you're talking.
okay, okay. Right. Here's an easy one. Um, what I actually care about is whether or not my child engages in interesting creative activities or veges out with his iPad. The thing that's collectible is screen time. Screen time is actually a lousy category, right? Screen time includes both my kid making playing chess and animating on his iPad and like
Right.
watching the dumbest possible YouTube videos. But the assessment of whether an act is creative and stimulating or not is not something that everyone can collect automatically in the same way. Screen time is something that any device and any person can measure in precisely the same way using a method that's available to everyone, right? Turn the watch on when the device is touched, stop when the device stops being interacted with. That's a mechanical target.
Okay.
Does that track?
Right. Now, but couldn't they, I mean, couldn't you just measure like how much screen time you did on different things, right? So
Right,
how much screen time was done on the math problems? How much screen time
right.
was done on the creative problems? That could be measured and collected.
Right. That can, but that requires an active judgment. So here's the thing. Screen time is a bucket that's okay. You're now pushing me into the weird deep part of the
Go
book.
for it.
What's really important, the actual thing that's really important here is the categories we use and the lines we draw between the categories, and whether those lines require a lot of judgment or whether they can be collected mechanically. So screen time, hopefully it's clear. That's like device on or off. Everyone agrees about that. Now here's the problem. There are a lot of apps that my kid interacts with, and it's really unclear whether they're stimulating or not. You actually have to watch.
Right.
So some people think Minecraft is a garbage game. I look at my kid playing Minecraft, and what I see is that he's using in-game tools to actually build devices and basically code in-game. It also depends on what he's doing. There's some parts of Minecraft where he's just doing a boring clicking activity, and there are other parts where he's literally building a mechanical house and automating it. That's not a mechanical judgment. That's a judgment that requires looking at a complex activity
Right.
and making a discerning judgment about whether it's stimulating or not, right?
Well,
So that's
I think the AI programmers that are getting $1 million a year to start right now probably grew up playing those games that were
right.
creative.
Exactly. But does it make sense? So I just want you to know there is nobody out there like there is no easy measure. There's no app you can buy that will automatically record creative activity on an iPad because that app would need to be able to make that judgment, right?
Got it.
About every game they're playing. That's a very complex judgment, but they can judge screen time.
So this is a really good point, and that is, I want to talk a little bit about AI. I want to make sure we get to AI
Yeah,
because AI seems to have so much confirmation bias in it
right.
that it's really there's the judgment is in the question, not in the answer.
Mm.
Is there a way that AI can or will evolve so that there will be judgment there? But then if there is are we substituting our judgment for the
Right,
judgment of somebody else,
right.
the programmer,
Okay.
for example?
Oh my God. This is the most important question. Um, Let me give you a preface. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm
Me
not
neither.
an AI expert. I think about data. But there's okay, there are two kind of key concepts for my book that I think are really important here, and I just want to give you them really quickly and see if they plug in. So one is the idea of value capture, and the other is the idea of value laden technology. So let me just splash them down for you. Okay. So one of the things I'm really worried about metrics and data in general is a phenomenon we can call value capture. And value capture is when your values are rich and subtle, and you get parked in an environment that gives you very simple metrics that do not capture the fullness of your value, but you become dominated by that simple metric.
Mm,
Like starting to exercise for health, but becoming too interested in step counts, or starting your education for like growth and wisdom and getting captured by GPA, right? So one of the key ideas for me is that what's wrong with value capture is that you're outsourcing your values.
right.
And what you're typically doing is you're outsourcing your values to a metric that meets the standards we talked about before, right? It is something that is low context and mechanically applicable. And if there's anything that should not be forced to be low context and mechanical, it's your deepest cares. And I think a lot of the times when we get sucked into, right. Does it make sense? So
Yep.
that's the
Yep.
first thought. Here's the second thought. There's this So I'm a philosopher. One of the fields I spent some time in is philosophy of technology. And there's this fight between people from my field and a lot of scientists and engineers. So the standard view of a lot of scientists and engineers is that technologies are tools. They have no values of their own. They have no political stance of their own. It's the users that decide what to do with them. The standard view in my field is something like, no, no, when you make a device, you sneak all kinds of values
Of
into it,
course you do. Of
right?
course you do.
You make all kinds of decisions about what's important. You make all kinds of decisions about so if right if this
Well, we saw
if
so much of this during COVID, right? Where
right
we had certain things were, in the news, certain things really were not allowed to be in the news. I mean, there's so much bias going into that.
right so I mean here's a simple example. Take take something like so, a social media system like X. So X is a system that automatically promotes things that are liked, right?
Right.
There is already a profound, I mean, there is a bias towards
Yep.
rapid fire popularity, right? That's baked into the
Yep.
system.
Yep.
Um, One of my favorite philosophers has this great example about how the printing press is profoundly political. Just the basic thing is profoundly, it changes the nature of society because before the printing press, when communication was oral, everyone was empowered to change the news. And with
Mm,
the printing press, what that does is empower a small number of wealthier individuals or corporations.
right.
It centralizes who gets to produce the news. Now, this we're not saying that either one is better or worse, but there's this deep social change,
Mhm.
this deep value, and the value that's built into the printing press is centralized control over news.
Well, okay, so let's explore that. Fast forward to
Right.
2026.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So now we have the internet, which really, in ways, has democratized the news. On the other hand, we have the algorithms that give you bias after bias after bias. So if you pause on something, you get more of that.
Right. This is literally so I'm I when we're done with this, I'm gonna go grade my final papers for my I have a class on the politics of technology, and this is literally the thing we talk about for the whole class. So I think one of the most important technologies right now is, I mean, search algorithms because
Right.
search algorithms drive our attention. One way to put it is that we are outsourcing our attention to them, and any values that are baked into the algorithm are values that we are uptaking
Sure.
into our way of attending to the world. Um, and so Zeynep Tufekci, who's a new media scholar, has this great point exactly on your line. She says social media, on the one hand, decentralizes things because everyone gets to produce
Right.
content. But what it centralizes is which content people get exposure to.
Exactly.
One of the most interesting things I learned is that you might have thought in this era, in the Spotify era, that we would all listen to like a billion kinds of music. It turns out the world landscape has narrowed. Like people listen to much less variety in music than they used to. They mostly listen to what shows up as trending on the top page
Right.
because that technology essentially centralizes attention.
Interesting. All right.
So here,
Keep going.
here's one huge, I mean, what AI can and can't do is incredibly complicated, but here's one of my big worries. One of the things that it essentially does is it's one of its essential political pushes is it's going to focus all of our attention on the kinds of things that it's easy to gather mass data about. And we've already talked about the limitations about it, right? What it's going to do, here's my prediction, is that as a technology, it will tend to focus us as a society on social targets that are low context, low sensitivity, that anybody can understand instantly. Accessible, mechanical, decontextualized information, right? That's I mean, there are the AI Optus will propose lots of solutions to that. But my worry is that baked into the massive landscape of big data are those limitations.
Well, it seems like baked into that is actually division.
Right.
Because if it concentrates what you see on what basically you want to see, right? Then you're right, and the next person's wrong because they're seeing what they want to see.
Right. I mean, that's actually a really that is something that some people think is fixable. And we're about to go way far away from talking about data to talking about social media algorithms. But let me think about what can be said in a. This is, by the way, this is one of the ways I got into this was talking about how social media changed politics and how, in particular, the scoring system of social
Right.
media changed politics. You can set things up in different ways. You can create an algorithm that gives people what they want. You can also create an algorithm that gives people what they don't want. That's literally a setting that someone out there can tweak, right? That's I mean, what to me is interesting is that our central relationship to at least search engines and social media is outsourcing attention. Like let me put it this way. Google could tomorrow flip a switch and instead of giving us what we wanted, give us what we didn't want. What remains the same is that the power over our attention in our current relationship to social media and technology is one where we're outsourcing our decisions about what to look at to some distant technology that we don't understand. And so the philosopher Shannon Valor has this great paper that my students love about moral deskilling and upskilling. And one of her worries is a lot of new AI automated technologies are replacing moral decisions.
Mhm.
Like there are AI recommenders
Sure.
for whether or not police should shoot at someone or or infantry. There are AI recommenders in the healthcare industry, and one of the things she's worried is that as humans, the more we trust these devices, the more we lose trust in ourselves. And one of my worries
Well, we
is,
lose muscle.
but if you think that whenever something is automated and you rely on it, you lose that muscle, and you think that AI is starting to automate for us where we choose our attention and what we value and what we set as targets, then the muscle we're losing is the muscle of deciding for ourselves what's important for ourselves.
Right? I mean, this is fascinating. Now, before we started, you want to make sure we talked about fake objectivity. So I'm going to
Oh,
bring this
right.
back to fake
Okay.
objectivity, and then I want to wrap up with a couple of good and bad. So
Okay.
Go ahead. I want to hear the fake objectivity.
Okay, great. This is tied into everything we're talking about. I think the reason that it's so easy to trust a lot of these technologies is part of a larger tendency of thinking. Okay, here's what I'm worried about. A lot of the times when you set up a metric, um, you make a lot of subjective value-laden decisions at the outset of setting up the metric, right? You decide what to collect, you decide what matters. So for the metric that I got the most interested in was a student success metric. And one of the things I noticed was that the student success metric was defined not in terms of student happiness, but in terms of graduation rate. In other words, like it was defined in terms of what administrators cared about and less about what students cared about, right? There's no measure of student fulfillment. So that's a subjective decision. But when you put that at the bottom and you pile a lot of mechanical processing on it, what comes out the other end looks to people like objective. There's just a number that says whether your students are succeeding more or not, and it's easy to hide the subjective start. So I've been calling this objectivity laundering.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like the whole point of like money laundering is you have dirty money and you pass enough stuff, and it's
Yep.
still dirty, but there's been this crap piled on top. The reason I wanted to talk about this with you is because I found this incredible account of the beginning of objectivity laundering from a historian named Mary Poovey. And she says that, uh, she says, she says that what it means to be factual and true has changed over time. And what it used to mean was that something was factual or true if it came from a trustworthy, good person, right?
Right.
And now what factual and true means is that it has been processed mechanically so that no particular point of view has infected it. And she thinks the first place we really started to do this was double entry bookkeeping. She thinks the invention of double entry bookkeeping, I think in 16th century Italy, was the
Mhm.
first place where we created a system where the point was you didn't have to trust anybody in particular because every movement in the system was completely visible
Sure.
and completely checkable mechanically. And then she says this thing that I find completely devastating. She says, but there's one core, when they started double entry bookkeeping, there was one core number that was completely non-mechanical. It was the initial valuation of goods in the inventory, right? When
Right.
you did that, you could write anything you wanted. That is an entirely subjective, discerning,
Right.
non-mechanical judgment. You put that in the beginning, and then you pile on tons and tons of clear mechanical processing, and then suddenly what looks on the comes out the other end looks to be able to be utterly objective. But you've
Right.
hidden the initial
Well,
valuation.
and let's take this to modern day, which now we have triple entry bookkeeping, which we call blockchain, which that's all blockchain technology is triple entry accounting, right? You have double
Right,
entry plus you've got an auditor, right?
right,
But if you start with the wrong number, then it is actually codified as being true. So
right,
let me give you an example where I've always felt like blockchain would be most useful is in property titles,
right,
right? The challenge is the property title right in the first place, right? If it's right in the first place, once you put blockchain on it, it's immutable, right?
right.
It takes care of itself. But that would be an example, I would think, of what you're talking about, where you could literally have fake objectivity.
Can I give you another example
Please.
is from accounting, and I'm really interested in whether this is totally boring and familiar to you or if it's new. So, um, one of the examples from Theodore Porter about this is so the center of this book, Trust in Numbers, is a long history of cost benefit analysis.
Okay.
Um, and one of the things he notes is that there is a number at the bottom that's crucial to every cost benefit analysis that seems to be entirely subjective, but people hide, and that's the discount rate of future
Yes.
values to present values, right?
Yep. Yep.
So here's right there's not an
Sure.
objective there's not an objective um Adam Smith, like you can see Adam Smith
There's no
working this out.
objective discount rate.
There's no objective discount rate.
Correct.
Someone has to set the discount rate. He was looking at an example where like a cost benefit analysis of whether you should invest in national parks involved two things, a discount rate and also a setting of a dollar value of the spiritual value to the park per visitor day. And these are the kinds of things that go in at the bottom of a cost benefit analysis, right?
Right.
That are and then here's my worry. We're hiding it enough. We're doing one level of objectivity laundering is if we just do regular accounting on it, and
Mhm.
then you insert an AI in the middle,
Right.
right? And I mean, from my perspective, that's just more complicated, opaque mechanical moves
You're
that
just compounding
launder
the
out.
problem.
Right, right,
You're just compounding the problem. It's like when I hear a financial planner talk about compound interest, and I don't know if you ever see this chart where they start with a penny on day one and day 31, it's $10 million. Okay, well, what they don't tell you is A, what's the rate of return? Because they don't
right,
tell you how long that day is, right? Because it's not 24 hours, it's not even a year. In some cases, it could be 30 years, right? And so you don't know if that 31 days is 300 days, 300 years,
right,
3,000 years. You don't know that. So to me, it sounds like that's the same thing. Is that discount rate? Is it risk adjusted? Is it unrisk?
right.
Is it for a particular industry, et cetera? You're right. I mean, discount rate is everything, just like the rate on the compound interest is everything. It's just the reverse of that, right? So that is fascinating. I love that. Okay, so I will use that. So thank you, and I will use that when I teach, because I love that whole idea of the of the objectivity laundering. That's fantastic. Now, if we can, let's just finish up with what do you see? Give us a couple of good things about data, big
Right,
data, and a couple of things that we need to watch out for that could be harmful to us, in
right,
particularly from a business owner and investor.
right. Um, okay. So every time I criticize big data, I have to also add that without big data approaches, I would be dead and my kids would be dead. Right? This is one of the big data approaches is medical science.
Hmm.
And I'm an asthmatic. My kid's an asthmatic. Would be long dead. So large data methods are incredibly good at optimizing for things that are easy to measure. Whether someone lived or died is easy to measure, right? Whether or not an antibiotic got a bacteria out of your system, very easy to record, very easy to measure. Everyone agrees. Not an incredibly subtle, delicate, high context issue. So that's what big data is great for, right? The thing that I'm most worried about is the things we actually care about, the things that make our lives go better, and those are often not recordable, but it's really easy to let that stuff be swamped out by what we have measures of, right? Like, um, I so sometimes what I think I fly fish, and sometimes I see people fly fishing and they're using one of these a new method. There are these modern methods, they're incredibly efficient, but they're not fun at all. And they'll be like, "Well, I'm not having fun, but you got to do it because it'll help you catch more fish." And you're like, "What is the point?" And what seems to be happening, right? Like we're doing catch and release fishing. You're letting the fish go. Like what are you doing? The point was to have fun, but it's really easy to
Yeah,
stop hearing that
yeah,
because the count of fish is really high.
the
And I'm
measurement.
worried that in general, it's so easy to measure various kinds of productivity and various kinds of productivity and optimization very easy. The optimization of very easily measurables is very loud, and so it's really easy to optimize for things like, I mean, just more money, higher rankings, more steps, right? But I mean, I think if you listen only to that, then you're like reprogramming yourself to only try to target what anybody can understand in an instant, and you're ignoring anything that's actually meaningful to you.
Yeah, you lose the richness of life.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, CT. The book is The Score. It's a great title of the book. And where could we find more about what you're doing? because I think this is
Right.
fascinating stuff.
I mean, yeah, my website is objectionable.net. My blue sky is ADD_HAWK, and I'm starting to post there. And yeah, I think a lot about both games and how we know things together and what we miss out on.
All right. Thank you so much. We've been with Dr. C.T. Nguyen, and the book is The Score. Just remember that not only does this affect our business because we're looking at, how can we use big data, but we can also use big data in such a way that actually damages us, not just professionally, but also personally. And we really need to understand the good and the bad of how big data is aggregated, what the biases are, and what we don't want is fake objectivity. And when we put this all together, we'll always end up with way more money and way less tax. And we'll see you next time on the Wealthability Show. Thanks for listening to the Wealthability Show. If today's episode gave you a new perspective, remember this: the tax law is not your enemy. It's a roadmap. And when you know how to follow it, you can build real, lasting wealth. If you're a business owner or investor who's tired of overpaying taxes, the Wealthability Accelerator is your next step. You'll have the opportunity to work directly with me for 80% less than my standard rate. And I'll personally guide you through how to change your facts so that you can change your tax. Go to wealthability.com/bonus and apply today. Remember, it's not just what you make, it's what you keep.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.